The rain had already been falling for hours before I reached the clearing. It wasn't the soft kind of rain that people find calming. It was heavy, cold, and steady, soaking through my jacket and dripping down the back of my neck every time the wind shifted. The year was 1997, and I was 26, still stubborn enough to think I could take on more than I should. I had driven out to a remote stretch of forest in northern Montana, a place I had only visited once before, because I thought I could build myself a small cabin with my own two hands. I told myself I needed a place away from the noise of town, away from people, away from the weight of everything. I wanted something simple, something quiet. When I parked my old truck on the dirt path earlier in the day, the air had been heavy with humidity. I could tell rain was coming, but I didn't expect it to start so suddenly or come down so hard. By the time I carried the supplies I had, an axe, a saw, some nails, a tarp, and a few other tools, into the clearing, the ground was already turning into mud. My boots sank with every step, making every load feel twice as heavy. The clearing itself was nothing special, just an open patch where trees had thinned out, bordered by tall pines and firs that swayed in the wind. The grass there was high, wet, and matted down by the rain. The soil smelled rich, dark, and almost metallic in the damp air. I set my pack down on a flat spot and looked around. I kept thinking that if I didn't get some kind of structure up before night, I would be sleeping in the truck, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to prove to myself that I could make this work. I began by chopping down a few thin trees. The sound of the axe striking would crack through the quiet between the rain and thunder. The effort was exhausting in the damp air, and sweat mixed with rain until I couldn't tell the difference. My palms grew sore under the wooden handle, but I kept going. Every few minutes I'd stop and glance at the tree line. The forest seemed too still, even with the rain. No birds, no movement, just that wall of trees watching me work. I dragged the logs toward the center of the clearing and laid them out for the base of the cabin. I had sketched a rough plan before coming here, but now, with the rain washing the dirt clean and my paper ruined, I had to work from memory. My plan was simple. 4 walls, a roof, no floor yet. Just something that could keep me dry. I wasn't expecting comfort, just shelter. As the light began to fade, the storm picked up. The sky turned darker than it should have at that hour, and thunder rolled across the mountains. The tarp I had brought was barely enough to cover one side of the frame I had started. I tried tying it down with rope, but the wind kept snapping it loose. I cursed under my breath and kept pulling it tight, securing it again and again until my fingers felt raw. By the time night fell, the cabin was no more than 3 walls of rough logs stacked unevenly, with a tarp sagging over part of the top. Rain still slipped through the gaps, dripping onto the inside. My clothes clung to me, heavy and clammy. I tried to ignore the discomfort and focused on getting a fire started. I gathered what dry wood I could find under a few thick trees, but even that was damp. I managed to light a small fire after several frustrating tries, shielding it from the rain with rocks and the logs themselves. The flames sputtered, but they held on, casting a dim orange glow that danced across the wet wood of the half-built cabin. I sat close to the fire, hugging my knees, listening to the sound of the rain hammering the tarp and the logs. The forest around me was pitch black now, the kind of darkness where even the outlines of trees disappear if you stare too long. The wind pushed the trees until they groaned and cracked, their branches bending and snapping somewhere deep in the woods. What unsettled me most wasn't the storm, though. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept turning my head, scanning the darkness between the trees. At first, I thought it was just nerves. Anyone alone in the woods at night would feel uneasy. But then I noticed things that didn't sit right. At one point, I heard a crunch, distinct from the constant patter of rain. It was the sound of something stepping on wet undergrowth. I froze, staring out toward the sound, but the darkness revealed nothing. A few minutes later, it happened again. closer this time. My skin prickled and my stomach twisted. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe an elk, moving through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever it was, it had stopped when I listened. I pulled my axe closer and set it on the ground beside me. My firelight barely reached beyond the edge of the clearing, and beyond that circle of light was just blackness. I tried to focus on the cabin, on the progress I had made, but every sound outside seemed sharper now. Rain dripping from a branch, wind pushing through leaves, and again, that crunching sound, faint but steady, circling. The hours dragged on. Couldn't sleep. My eyes kept flicking open, searching the shadows, and every time I thought I saw movement, I would blink and it would be gone. The fire burned low, and I had to get up to feed it, my boots sinking into the mud. I hated turning my back to the trees even for a moment. My nerves were stretched thin, and the rain never let up, pounding the tarp until I thought it would tear away. Sometime past midnight, I finally saw it. A shape, not clear, not close, but there. At the edge of the trees, something shifted. It was tall enough to catch my eye against the line of the pines, just for a second, before it stepped back and vanished. My chest tightened, and I gripped the axe so hard my knuckles hurt. I stared into that spot until my eyes watered, but nothing moved again. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in the wet dirt, half in and out of the broken cabin. The rain finally eased to a drizzle, and gray light spread across the clearing. My fire had burned out, leaving only smoke and blackened wood. I stood up stiffly, my muscles aching from sitting tense for so long. In the daylight, I walked the edge of the clearing, looking for prints. The ground was too wet and messy to show much, but I thought I saw something. Faint impressions in the mud, larger than my boot, leading between the trees and disappearing into the brush. They weren't clear enough to say for certain what made them, but they didn't look like deer or elk. That was enough for me. My plan of staying out here, of building the cabin piece by piece, felt like a mistake now. I could still hear the rain dripping from the trees, but underneath it all, the forest was silent again, watching. I packed up my tools as fast as I could, shoving everything back into the truck, my hands still shaking from the night. When I pulled away down the muddy path, I didn't look back at the half-built cabin. It was just a pile of wet logs now, but to me it was something else, a warning. I told myself I'd never come back to that spot. Whatever was out there in those woods, whether it was animal or something worse, it had made itself known. I drove until the forest thinned and the rain turned to mist, and I didn't stop until I saw pavement again. The thought of building that cabin never crossed my mind after that night. The idea of a quiet life alone in the woods had seemed so perfect in my head, but the reality was different. Out there, I wasn't alone, no matter how much I wanted to be. That half-finished cabin is probably still there, rotting in the clearing, but it doesn't belong to me anymore. I left it behind because I knew better. Some places don't want you, and that night in the rain taught me that the hard way. I still think about what happened that night more than 20 years later. Back then, I was 27, living in Michigan, and I had borrowed a small hunting cabin for a weekend away. A friend from work had let me use it since he said no one really stayed there outside of deer season. It sat in a clearing about 2 miles off a dirt road, surrounded by heavy pine woods and swampy patches where the ground stayed wet most of the year. The place had no electricity and no running water, just a wood stove and a hand pump outside. I wasn't there for comfort anyway. I just wanted a break from the noise of the city, a chance to be by myself. I drove up on a Friday evening in early October 2003. The air had already turned sharp, and when I pulled up to the cabin, the light was fading fast. The place looked small but solid, built from dark logs, the roof covered in brown shingles gone soft from moss. The porch leaned a little, and the screen door squeaked like something out of an old movie when I opened it. Inside smelled like dry wood and mouse droppings. There was a cot against the back wall, a table and 2 chairs, a pile of split firewood stacked inside, and not much else. After unloading my small cooler and sleeping bag, I set about making a fire in the stove. It took a while since the wood was a bit damp, but eventually I got the cabin warm enough to shake off the chill. I heated up a can of soup, ate it with crackers, and sat there in the orange glow of the flames, enjoying the silence. The only sounds came from the crackling fire and the occasional groan of the cabin shifting as it cooled outside. By 9 o'clock, it was already pitch black out the windows. I stepped outside with my flashlight and smoked a cigarette, standing in the clearing. The woods around me felt endless and heavy, the kind of dark that pressed against the edges of the light beam. I heard something moving far off in the trees, probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, it made me finish the smoke quickly and head back inside. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The cot was thin, and every noise outside seemed to travel right through the log walls. Around midnight, I woke to a sound like crunching leaves just outside the window. It came in short bursts, 3 or 4 steps, then silence, then another 2 steps. I lay completely still, breathing shallow, staring at the dark ceiling. The steps circled slowly around the cabin, then stopped at the back wall. I waited, straining my ears. A branch snapped, sharp and clean. Then nothing. I must have stayed awake another hour, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a deer nosing around. I stepped outside into the cold air and looked around the clearing. At first, nothing seemed odd. Then I noticed prints in the dirt by the back wall. Not hoof marks, boots. The ground was soft enough that I could see the tread pattern, narrow with a worn heel. The tracks led out of the clearing and vanished into the pines. I stood there a long time, staring into the woods, trying to imagine who would walk all the way out here in the middle of the night. I told myself hunters sometimes cut through this land, maybe heading to a tree stand. I tried not to think about the fact that it was too early in the season and that hunters usually carried flashlights. I made coffee on the stove and forced myself to relax. The rest of the day passed slow. I walked the trail down to the swamp, skipped rocks across the water, and chopped some kindling. Still, the feeling of those boot prints sat in the back of my mind. That night, I made the fire bigger, hoping the noise of it would help me sleep. I left my flashlight within reach on the table. I crawled into my sleeping bag on the cot, telling myself I was just being jumpy. For a while I dozed. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps that woke me, but a faint scraping sound, like metal against wood, came from the door. My mouth went dry. The sound repeated, slow, deliberate. I eased myself up and reached for the flashlight. When I flicked it on, the beam cut across the room and lit up the door. The scraping stopped. My heart hammered so loud I could barely hear. I stayed frozen like that, light aimed at the door, waiting for it to move. After a minute or two, I turned the light off and sat in the dark, listening. Nothing. Finally, exhaustion pulled me back down, and at some point, I fell into a light, broken sleep. At dawn, I stepped outside. The first thing I saw was the door frame, a small mark fresh right by the handle. A knife scrape, clean into the wood. My stomach turned. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been trying to open the cabin. I looked around the clearing and noticed more boot prints circling wide. Whoever it was had walked the perimeter over and over. I wanted to leave right then, but my truck was low on gas, and the nearest station was 20 miles back down the dirt road. I decided I'd stay through the day, then leave before nightfall. The hours crawled by. Every sound outside made me jump. I sat at the table with my back to the wall, staring at the door, the axe I used for firewood within arm's reach. By late afternoon, The sky turned gray and the woods grew darker. That was when I heard it again, footsteps. Not far off this time, but close, moving along the tree line. I killed the fire in the stove so no smoke would give me away and sat in silence. The steps came closer, crunching leaves and snapping twigs, until they stopped just beyond the clearing. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the steps retreated into the woods. That was enough for me. I grabbed my cooler, sleeping bag, and shoved them in the truck. The engine coughed before starting, and for a second I thought it wouldn't catch. When it roared to life, I pulled out fast, gravel spitting under the tires. In the rearview mirror, the cabin shrank into the trees. That whole drive back to the highway, I kept checking behind me, half expecting headlights to appear. I never went back to that cabin. On Monday, I told my coworker what I'd seen, but he just laughed and said the place always gave people the creeps. He didn't seem surprised about the boot prints or the scratches. He only said, "Yeah, that land draws some strange folks." He didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. I learned something out there. It's not ghosts or monsters you have to worry about in the woods. It's people. Someone walked around that cabin 2 nights in a row. Someone who carried a knife and tried the door while I was inside. I don't know why they stopped or why they never forced their way in. Maybe they were testing me. Maybe they were waiting for me to come outside. I'll never know. But I do know this. When you're miles from anywhere, with nothing but trees around you, even the smallest sound can mean danger. And if you ever see boot prints where none should be, take them seriously. That's not your imagination. That's someone else out there. I didn't wait around long enough to meet them, and I'm glad for that. I had always liked being out in the woods. There was something about the silence that felt different from anywhere else. The way the trees pressed in on you but still gave a kind of calm. Back in the fall of 1997, when I was 29, I drove out to a hunting cabin that my uncle had once owned in northern Wisconsin. He hadn't used it for years, and after he passed, the place just sat there, tucked into the pines by an old logging road that barely showed on maps anymore. I had been meaning to go out there, clean it up, and maybe use it for deer season. The drive in was long. The dirt road seemed narrower than I remembered, branches scraping the side of my truck, leaves piling up thick where no one had driven for months. The air was sharp and cold, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees. It was a squat little building, just 1 floor with a short porch, the kind of place that looked more like a shed than a house. The windows were cloudy with grime, and the roof sagged in one corner. Inside, it smelled like mildew and old wood. Dust coated the counter, and cobwebs clung to the corners. A couple of old deer antlers were nailed to the wall above the fireplace, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been moved since the early 80s. There was no electricity, no running water, just an iron stove in the corner and a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress. It was what you'd expect from a cabin built for hunting, barely more than a shelter. I unpacked my gear, set my rifle by the bed, and decided I'd make a small fire in the stove. I had brought food, but I wasn't too hungry, so I just warmed a can of beans and sat there with the dim light from my lantern filling the room. The silence was heavier out there than it was back home. No cars, no neighbors, just wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That first night, I tried to sleep, but every small noise kept waking me. A branch scratching the roof, the shifting of the old boards under the cabin. Even the sound of the wind seemed louder. Around 2 in the morning, I sat up and thought I heard something outside, just a shuffle, like feet dragging in the dirt. I told myself it was probably a raccoon nosing around. Still, I reached over and laid my hand on the rifle, just in case. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked the property, checking the area like I used to do when I hunted with my uncle. The woods were dense, tall pines and birches crowding together. I noticed right away that there were tire tracks in the dirt not far from the cabin. They were faint but fresh enough to catch my attention, the mud still soft where the grooves had pressed. That unsettled me because the cabin was miles off the main road, and nobody had a reason to be out there unless they knew about it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was maybe from a hunter scouting early, but as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. While moving through the brush, I spotted cigarette butts near a tree line, not weathered or rained on, which meant they were recent. My uncle never smoked, and neither did I. By the time evening came, my nerves were tight. I stayed inside, locking the old wooden door even though it wouldn't hold against much. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin, and I tried to focus on reading a paperback I had brought. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of leaves outside. Not quick steps, but slow, deliberate ones circling. My chest went tight. I set the book down, blew out the lantern, and stood by the window, peeking through the grime. The moon was high, spilling just enough light to see the clearing. First, I saw nothing. Then, near the edge of the trees, I caught the faint outline of someone standing there, still as a post. I couldn't make out details, but it was a person. They didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there watching. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, staring back, but after a while, when I blinked, the figure was gone. Sleep was impossible. Every sound pressed on me, and I kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to convince myself maybe it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Someone had been there. The following day, I thought about leaving, but curiosity and stubbornness held me back. I walked down the dirt road, looking for tracks. Sure enough, I found footprints in the mud. Not boots like mine, but worn sneakers, leading toward the cabin and then back into the woods. My stomach dropped. That night, I was ready. I kept the rifle close and set the lantern low. Around 1 in the morning, the noises started again. Crunching leaves, the faint creak of a branch being stepped on. This time, I didn't wait. I eased over to the window and saw movement, a shadow slipping between trees. Then another. My skin crawled. It wasn't just one person. They didn't rush the cabin, didn't make noise like drunks or kids messing around. They were patient, circling. I sat in the dark, heart hammering, gripping the rifle so tight my knuckles hurt. Hours dragged by, and eventually the noises faded. But I knew they were still out there, watching. I made it until morning, then packed fast. I shoved everything back into the truck, keeping my head on a swivel. When I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Right under the porch window in the dirt was a single shoe print, pressed fresh from the night before. Whoever it was had come close enough to peer inside while I sat in the dark pretending not to breathe. I didn't hesitate. I started the truck, slammed it into gear, and barreled down that dirt road as fast as I could without snapping an axle. Every shadow between the trees felt like someone waiting to step out, but no one came. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop until I was back in town. At a gas station, I sat for nearly an hour, hands shaking, trying to calm myself. I thought about going to the police, but what could I say? That someone had stood in the woods at night and watched me? They hadn't broken in, hadn't taken anything. Still, I knew better than to dismiss it. Those footprints, the cigarette butts, the circling at night, it wasn't random. Someone had been using those woods, and they didn't like me being there. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, I handed the keys to a cousin and told him he could do whatever he wanted with it. I didn't want it anymore. Every time I thought about those nights, I remembered the feeling of being watched, the cold stare from the tree line, and the print under my window. People think the woods are empty, peaceful, but they're not. They hide everything, sounds, movements, people who know how to disappear. And when you're miles from anywhere, with no one around to hear you, the scariest thing isn't what you imagine. It's what's really there, standing in the dark, waiting. I had been traveling through the western part of the Amazon basin in the summer of 1997, chasing something I couldn't even explain to myself. I was 34 years old then, a man who felt stuck between lives. My work back home had burned me out, my marriage had collapsed, and I thought I might find some kind of meaning by putting distance between myself and everything I knew. The Amazon had always felt like one of those places that could erase you if you weren't careful. That was exactly why I went there. I told myself I wanted quiet, I wanted to be cut off, but I didn't know what that really meant until I was standing in the middle of that endless green. I had rented a small boat to push deeper along one of the side rivers. Not one of the famous tourist routes, but a place where the air hung heavy, where you barely saw another person for days. I had brought only the essentials: a pack, a knife, some dried food, a few jugs of water, and a rough map a local had sketched for me. The boat motor gave me trouble more than once, and that was when I realized how reckless it all was. Out there, no one was coming if something went wrong. The rain hit on the third night. Not the quick showers I had seen before, but hours of pounding water that blurred the trees into one dark wall. The river rose, the current pulled harder, and the boat rocked as if it might split in two. I searched for higher ground, guiding the boat to a muddy bank where I tied it off to a thick root. The map showed a cabin not far from there, a place built years ago for logging crews but long abandoned. I figured I could wait out the storm there. I climbed up through the wet vines and slick earth, my boots sinking ankle deep in mud with every step. My pack felt heavier than it should have. The sounds of insects and frogs filled the night, but the rain muffled most of it into a constant roar. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 15 minutes, I saw a dark outline through the trees, a roof, a straight line against the wild shapes of the forest. Relief hit me sharp and sudden. The cabin was rough, just wood nailed together, gaps in the walls, and a tin roof that rattled under the rain. The door hung on one hinge. It should have felt empty, but when I stepped inside, the smell stopped me cold. It was thick, sour, and heavy. Not just rot or mold, worse. It clung to my throat, made me gag, and I knew instantly what it was before I even saw. The lantern in my pack flickered when I lit it. The beam cut across the room, showing dust on the floorboards. A table collapsed in one corner, and then something against the far wall. I thought it was a bundle of clothes at first, but the shape was too clear. It was a body. The man had been there for a while. His clothes were stiff, stained dark, his skin drawn tight and gray. One arm was twisted under him, the other stretched toward the door as if he had been crawling. His eyes were gone, sockets empty, and insects moved in the hollow places. I turned away fast, while burning my throat, but the image stuck. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. I didn't know who he was or how he died, but it looked violent. The side of his shirt was torn, dark patches spreading from the wound. A machete lay nearby, rusty but stained in a way that didn't look like rust. The storm outside raged harder, so leaving wasn't an option. I was stuck in there in that cabin with him. I tried to sit by the door, keeping as much distance as I could, but the smell and the weight of his presence filled every corner. My dog, who had followed me on this trip, pressed against my leg. He was restless, ears perked, growling low in his chest, as if he didn't like being near that body either. I kept telling myself I'd leave as soon as daylight came, but the hours dragged. Every sound outside, the snap of branches, the rush of water, the calls of night animals, sounded sharper, more threatening. I started thinking about how he had died. Maybe it was a fight, maybe he was running from someone, maybe someone else had been with him. The thought that whoever did it could still be nearby kept me from closing my eyes. By morning, the rain slowed. The light that came through the gaps in the wall was weak but enough to move by. I forced myself to go closer to the body. His clothes were military-style, old camouflage pants and a faded green shirt. In his pocket, I found an ID card, laminated but warped with damp. The name was in Portuguese, but the date of birth told me he was younger than me, late 20s. On the back, there was a number, maybe for some kind of unit or crew. I knew then I couldn't just leave him there. If someone back home was waiting for him, they'd never know. The jungle would swallow him whole. I dragged him outside, struggling with the dead weight, the smell overwhelming me every time I shifted him. I used the machete to dig into the wet earth behind the cabin. The ground was soft from the rain, but it took hours. By the time I laid him in the shallow pit and covered him with soil, my arms shook from exhaustion. I marked the spot with a cross made from branches, though I doubted anyone would ever see it. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed details I had missed in the dark. There were bullet holes in the wall, small and neat. The table wasn't just collapsed. It looked like it had been shoved hard during a fight. On the floor under the dirt was a smear that could have been blood. The picture became clearer. This man had been ambushed here, maybe shot, maybe left to die. I packed fast. I didn't care about resting anymore. The storm had eased enough to move, and I wanted nothing more than to put miles between me and that place. As I untied the boat, I looked back once. The cabin sat crooked against the trees, silent now, but it felt charged, as if the air itself held the memory of what had happened there. The trip back downriver was tense. Every bend made me expect another boat to appear, armed men searching for what I had seen. I imagined them wondering if I had taken anything, if I knew too much. But no one came, just endless green, the drone of insects, and the steady flow of the river. By the time I reached the small village where I had started, I was a different man. I didn't tell anyone what I found. Not the locals, not the few officials who sat by the docks. Something in me knew it was safer to keep it quiet. I carried it instead, the image of that body, the smell of it, the weight of earth on my hands. Even now, years later, I still see him when I close my eyes, the way he reached for the door, the empty sockets where his eyes had been. The jungle had shown me what it really was. Not just wild and beautiful, but a place that swallowed men whole. A place where the line between living and dead blurred quick. That cabin is probably gone now, rotted into the soil, but I know what I left there. And sometimes I think about how close I was to becoming another forgotten body in the Amazon, one storm away from the same fate. I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in Montana during the summer of 2006. I was 27 back then, not much experience under my belt, but enough to know how lonely and unnerving the wilderness could be when you were by yourself. The Park Service had assigned me to a small cabin deep in the Bitterroot Range, about 6 miles from the main ranger station. It was one of those outposts they used for fire watch and for keeping an eye on remote trails. The cabin wasn't large, just one room with a cot, a desk, a wood stove, and shelves stocked with canned food, lantern fuel, and maps. It sat on a clearing with thick forest pressing close from all sides. The hike to the cabin on my first day felt long. I had a heavy pack with extra supplies and a radio strapped to my shoulder. The trail was narrow, half overgrown, and the kind of quiet that makes you think too much. Every twig snap made me look over my shoulder, even though I knew it was just deer or squirrels. By the time I reached the cabin, I was drenched in sweat and glad to see the rough pine walls and metal roof. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the stale smell of wood and dust hit me. The place hadn't been used in weeks. My days out there followed a routine. I woke early, boiled water on the stove, filled out weather logs, and checked the radio. After that, I'd hike sections of the trails, check for storm damage, and sometimes climb up the ridge to scan for smoke. The work wasn't glamorous, but it felt important. Nights were the hardest. When the sun dropped behind the tree line, the woods went pitch black, and every sound carried. The cabin creaked, the wind groaned in the trees, and I could hear animals moving just beyond the clearing. About a week into my assignment, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. Small details, but enough to gnaw at me. One morning, I stepped outside and saw boot prints in the mud near the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. The tread was different, and they circled the cabin once before heading off toward the treeline. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe another ranger had come by, or maybe a hiker had wandered too close, but the trail was too far from the usual routes for random visitors. I let it go until 2 nights later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the faint sound of movement outside. At first, I thought it was an elk pushing through the brush, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay still on the cot, staring at the ceiling. I didn't have the guts to move. I just listened. The steps stopped right by the window. I could almost feel someone standing there, watching. After what felt like an eternity, the sound faded into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I went out to check. Sure enough, there were fresh boot prints again, this time clearer in the damp soil. Same tread as before. Someone had been pacing around the cabin in the dark. I followed the prints for a while, but they led into thick brush and vanished. I radioed the main station, mentioned that I might have hikers straying near my post, but kept my voice calm. I didn't want them to think I was spooked or unfit for the job. They told me to keep an eye out and log anything unusual. After that, I became more alert. I started locking the cabin door at night, even though the lock was just a flimsy latch. I kept my flashlight and bear spray right by the cot. My hikes grew shorter. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, ears straining for the sound of branches snapping that didn't belong to wildlife. I even began noticing little things moved inside the cabin. A lantern shifted on the shelf, my boots not where I left them. I told myself I might have done it without thinking, but deep down I knew better. One evening, about 10 days in, I climbed the ridge later than usual. The sun was setting fast, painting the sky red and orange, and I knew I should have turned back earlier. As I made my way down, I spotted something that froze me. At the edge of the clearing near my cabin, just where the tree line started, there was a figure standing still. Too far for me to make out details, but definitely a man. He wasn't moving, just watching the cabin. I ducked low and stayed hidden in the brush for nearly an hour until the light was gone. When I finally crept back, the figure was gone, but the unease stayed lodged in my chest like a stone. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat up with the lantern on, straining to hear any noise outside. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps came again. This time they were bolder, slower, almost like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. They circled the cabin twice, pausing at the window and door. The latch rattled once, softly, as if someone was testing it. I held the bear spray so tight my hand hurt. By sunrise, I was exhausted and on edge. I walked the perimeter and found cigarette butts near the treeline. Someone had been standing there long enough to smoke more than once. That was when I made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait around to see how far this person was willing to push things. I radioed the main station again, told them firmly that I needed someone to come out. They said it would take a few hours. While I waited, I packed my gear and kept watch from the window. The woods were silent, but every shadow looked like a man waiting. Around noon, I heard movement again. Sticks breaking, brush rustling. I grabbed the radio, ready to call in, but then I saw 2 other rangers coming up the trail. Relief hit me hard. When they reached the cabin, I showed them the prints, the cigarette butts, and told them everything. We did a sweep of the area together. About half a mile away, Deeper in the woods, we found signs of a camp. A crude lean-to made of branches, a burned-out fire pit, and food wrappers. Whoever had been out there had been watching me for days. The prints matched the ones around my cabin. The camp looked abandoned in a hurry, like they'd cleared out once they realized more rangers were coming. We never found the person. The rangers told me it wasn't the first time something like this had happened in remote posts. Sometimes it was drifters, sometimes poachers, sometimes just unstable people hiding in the woods. That didn't make it easier to swallow. I was pulled from the cabin early and reassigned closer to the main station for the rest of the season. I didn't argue. Even now, years later, I think about those nights in that cabin. The sound of someone circling in the dark, pausing at my window, testing the door. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked it, or if I had stepped outside at the wrong time. The wilderness can make you feel alone, but it's the thought of someone else out there, quietly watching, that still keeps me awake sometimes. I was 29 years old in the fall of 2012 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small hunting cabin I had bought in northern Arizona, not far from the New Mexico border. It was nothing fancy, just a one-room wooden structure with a tin roof and a stone chimney. I had picked it up cheap the year before, thinking I'd use it for quiet weekends away from work and the noise of the city. I had been up there a few times with friends, but this trip was the first time I went alone. I thought I would enjoy the peace, the space, and the time to clear my head. The cabin sat about 3 miles off the nearest dirt road, tucked into a cluster of pine trees on the edge of a wide clearing. To reach it, I had to park my truck at the end of the rough path and haul my supplies in with a pack. It was remote, which was exactly what I thought I wanted at the time. The air smelled sharp with pine and earth. The nights were cold enough that I had to keep the wood stove going, and the days were quiet except for the wind sliding through the trees. The first 2 days went as expected. I cooked simple meals on the wood stove, chopped firewood, and walked the trails that stretched out into the hills behind the cabin. I saw deer tracks in the soft soil and once spotted a coyote in the distance, but nothing unusual. At night, I sat outside with a lantern and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, though I did notice how dark it became once the sun went down. Out there, away from town, there were no streetlights or distant glow. Once night fell, it was black except for the stars. On the third night, I was woken up around 2 in the morning by a sound outside. At first I thought it was just an animal moving through the brush, maybe a deer. The noise was heavy enough to make me sit up. It wasn't the light step of a raccoon or a rabbit. I sat still in bed, my ears straining, and heard what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps in the clearing outside the cabin. I told myself it was just an elk or maybe cattle that had wandered close. Still, the hairs on my arms stood up. The cabin only had one small window, and I pulled back the curtain just a crack. The moon was bright that night, throwing pale light across the clearing. I didn't see anything at first, just the open ground and the dark line of trees. Then I noticed movement near the edge of the clearing. Something was standing there, just inside the tree line. It looked too tall to be a coyote, but too narrow to be a bear. I couldn't make out much detail, just the outline of a figure standing unnaturally still, as though it was watching the cabin. My chest tightened. I stayed at the window for what felt like forever, my breath fogging the glass, but the shape didn't move closer. Eventually, I pulled the curtain shut and forced myself back into bed, though I hardly slept after that. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the way the moonlight hit the trees. I spent the day hiking, gathering more firewood, and trying to shake the unease. But when night came again, I felt that same nervousness creep back. I locked the door, latched the shutters, and sat with the lantern burning low. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps outside, slow and dragging. I froze, my body rigid on the bed. The steps circled the cabin this time, moving deliberately from one side to the other. I could hear them crunch on the gravel and brush around the foundation. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then came a scratching on the wall, long and uneven, like nails or sticks being dragged across the wood. I clenched my jaw and gripped the handle of the hatchet I kept near the bed. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but no animal walked on two legs and traced circles around a cabin like that. After an hour, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, I stepped outside and walked the perimeter. The dirt around the cabin showed tracks, but not clear paw prints. They looked almost human, but the stride was off. Too long, too heavy. I knelt down to study them, my skin crawling. The tracks led back toward the trees, then disappeared. That day I thought hard about leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I tried to distract myself with small chores, fixing a loose hinge on the door and stacking wood. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I stepped into the clearing, I felt eyes on me. I carried the hatchet everywhere. The fourth night was worse. Just after dusk, before I even lay down, I heard something move out in the clearing. I turned off the lantern and stood in the dark by the window, peeking out through the crack in the curtain. The moon wasn't as bright that night, but I could still make out the clearing. Something was standing there again, closer than before, halfway between the tree line and the cabin. It stood upright like a man, but its arms looked too long, and its posture was crooked, as if its joints didn't bend right. It stood there for what must have been 20 minutes, unmoving. I could feel my heart slam against my ribs. I stayed crouched at the window until the figure finally turned and slipped back into the trees. By then I knew I couldn't stay. To first light, I packed my things. The whole time I felt like I was being stalked. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I hiked the 3 miles back to my truck, looking over my shoulder the whole way. When I reached it, I threw my pack in the bed and drove without stopping until I reached the nearest gas station. I didn't go back to that cabin for months. When I finally did, in the spring, I found more of those strange tracks in the dirt, circling the building. A couple of the window shutters had been pulled loose, as if someone had tried to pry them open. I sold the cabin later that year. I never gave the real reason to the buyer. I just said I didn't use it enough. The truth was, I couldn't shake the memory of those nights. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the clearing, standing too still, too wrong, just watching me. Even now, years later, I can still hear the slow, deliberate footsteps outside the walls. I can still see the way it stood, waiting, and I know I was lucky I left when I did. I had never liked staying at that farm cabin, but it was the only option I had at the time. It was the summer of 1997, and I was 24 years old. My uncle owned a large stretch of farmland in rural Iowa, and he let me stay in the small cabin near the edge of his property while I worked on repairing fences for him. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1950s, and it had never been modernized. No running water, no electricity, and the nearest town was nearly 20 miles away. It sat in the middle of wide, flat fields with tall corn stalks stretching out in every direction. During the day, it didn't feel too bad, but once the sun went down, the place turned into something else entirely. The cabin had one room with a rusty iron bed frame, a small table, and a wood-burning stove that barely worked. The windows were single-pane glass, and the wind made them rattle. The walls were thin enough that I could hear crickets, owls, and every single gust of wind that came through the fields. I kept my truck parked just outside the cabin on a patch of dirt, but I didn't like leaving it there because once the night came, it felt like I was cut off from the rest of the world. The first few nights I stayed there weren't so bad. I worked all day fixing posts and pulling barbed wire, so by the time the sun went down, I was tired enough to fall asleep quickly. But on the fourth night, something felt wrong. I had gone to bed around 10, the moonlight just barely cutting through the thin curtains. At first, it was the usual night sounds, but then I noticed there was a strange stillness. The crickets had gone silent, and even the wind had died down. I lay there on the creaky bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. It wasn't silence exactly. There was something faint, like the crunch of footsteps in the dirt outside. I told myself it could have been a stray animal, maybe a raccoon, but the sound was too heavy for that. It was steady, slow, and deliberate. I didn't move. My uncle had warned me that sometimes people trespassed on his land, usually hunters or teenagers looking for a place to drink. I kept a hammer under the bed just in case, but I wasn't ready to grab it yet. The sound circled the cabin, crunching through the dry grass and soil. It wasn't hurried. It was careful, like whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. I held my breath as I listened. Then I heard the sound stop directly outside the window near my bed. The thin curtain shifted slightly from a breeze, and I felt a cold sweat form on my back. I didn't move, just kept staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to pass. After what felt like minutes, the footsteps started again, this time moving toward the back of the cabin. I sat up quietly, my bare feet touching the rough wooden floor. I reached under the bed and pulled out the hammer, gripping it tight. My heart was racing, but I tried to keep calm. I told myself it could just be my imagination, the sound of the fields settling at night. But then I heard it again, slow, dragging steps on the porch outside the front door. I sat there in the dark, hammer in hand, staring at the door. The old wood creaked as weight shifted on it. I knew the lock on that door wasn't strong. It was just an old metal latch. I thought about rushing out to my truck, but I didn't want to make noise and draw attention. So I waited, gripping the hammer until my hand ached. After a while, the sound stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every creak, every little sound, until the first light of dawn finally came through the window. When the sun rose, I stepped outside. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not sneakers, bare feet. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, then moved to the front porch. I crouched down and saw the prints clearly in the dry soil. They were wide, rough, and much larger than mine. My chest tightened. Whoever had been there wasn't some kid or neighbor passing through. I walked the perimeter of the cabin and followed the prints a little ways into the cornfield, but they disappeared quickly between the rows. That day, I didn't say anything to my uncle. I didn't want him to think I was paranoid or that I couldn't handle staying alone. I worked on the fences like usual, but I kept glancing back at the cornfield, half expecting to see someone standing there. When night came, I didn't want to go back inside the cabin, but I had nowhere else to go. I parked my truck closer to the door this time, thinking that if anything happened, I could run straight to it. That night was worse. I barely slept. Around midnight, the same thing happened again. The crickets went silent. The air felt heavy, and then the crunch of footsteps. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They went straight to the back window. I could hear the faint scrape of fingers against the glass. Not a knock, just a slow, dragging scrape. I held the hammer tight, my breathing shallow. The sound stopped, and for hours I waited, my eyes wide open, staring at the window. I didn't move until daylight came. The next morning, I found more footprints, fresh ones, leading back into the fields. The glass on the back window had smudge marks, like oily fingerprints pressed against it. That was the breaking point. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed my bag, locked the cabin as best I could, and drove straight back to my uncle's main house. I didn't care if he thought I was weak or making it up. I told him someone had been coming around the cabin at night, and I wasn't staying there anymore. He didn't argue. He just looked at me for a moment, then nodded. Later, I heard him telling one of the farmhands that people had gone missing in that area before. No explanations, no arrests, just people disappearing. The cornfields stretched on for miles, and if someone wanted to vanish out there, they could. I never went back to that cabin again. A month later, my uncle had it torn down. He didn't give me a reason, and I didn't ask. But sometimes, even now, I wake up at night and remember the sound of those bare footsteps circling the cabin, slow and steady, knowing I was inside. That was almost 30 years ago, and I still don't have an answer for who it was. All I know is that if I had opened that door or stayed another night, I might not be here to tell the story. I had been driving for hours on an old mountain road that cut through the thick woods of northern Arkansas. It was early fall, sometime in late September of 1998, and I had taken a wrong turn on my way to visit a friend who lived 2 towns over. The map I kept folded in the glove box was faded and torn, and the road signs out here were bent, rusted, or missing entirely. The longer I drove, the more it felt like I had slipped off the regular routes people normally took and ended up somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The sun had already dropped low enough that the trees cast long shadows across the gravel road. Every turn looked the same: dense oak trees, thick brush, and the occasional narrow clearing. I knew it would be a bad idea to keep driving into the dark since my gas tank had dipped below a quarter. Cell service wasn't something you could count on in 1998, especially not out here. That's when I saw it, just past a cluster of cedar trees. An old cabin sitting back about 50 yards from the road. The place was almost hidden, the roof line barely visible through the branches. Something about it caught my eye, maybe because I hadn't seen a single sign of life for miles. No houses, no parked trucks, not even a mailbox. Just that cabin, silent and slouched in the middle of overgrowth. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder and shut off the engine. The woods grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like even the crickets and birds had decided to keep their distance. My boots crunched over dry leaves as I walked up the barely there dirt path leading to the cabin. The closer I got, the more I noticed how far gone the place was. The wooden boards were warped and dark. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the shutters dangled from a single rusty hinge. It looked like nobody had set foot here in decades. Still, I couldn't ignore it. I needed to figure out where I was and how far I'd gone off course. I told myself maybe there would be an old phone inside, or at least a clue that could point me back toward the main road. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it gently, and it creaked open with a sound so sharp it made my stomach tighten. Inside, the air was stale, carrying that mix of dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic. The floor groaned under my weight as I stepped into the main room. There was no furniture except for a collapsed chair and a small wooden table shoved against the far wall. Every detail stood out. Cobwebs hung in thick strands across the corners. A broken oil lamp lay on its side, glass shattered in a neat circle around it. The wallpaper, if you could call it that, had peeled down in long strips, exposing gray wood beneath. I noticed scratches along the doorframe, thin vertical lines that looked deliberate. At first, I thought it was just wear from years of weather, but the grooves were too deep. I moved further in, shining my small flashlight around. There were 2 other doors, one leading to what looked like a back room and the other to a narrow hallway. I tried the back room first. The door stuck halfway, and I had to lean my shoulder into it to get it open. Inside was a tiny bedroom, though bedroom wasn't the right word anymore. The frame of a bed sat tilted, the mattress long gone, springs poking upward like ribs. The floor was littered with old newspapers, yellowed and crumbling at the edges. I bent down to pick one up. The date read July 1976. That was over 20 years ago, and the cabin looked like it hadn't seen use since then. But what got me wasn't the date. It was the article that had been circled in red pen. The headline talked about a missing hunter in the area. I skimmed it quickly, my pulse picking up. The man had never been found. I let the paper drop back onto the floor and backed out of the room. The hallway was darker, and the boards felt softer, like they could give way at any second. The walls narrowed in, making me feel boxed in. At the end of the hall, another door stood shut. I reached for the handle. It was colder than it should have been, even in the chill of fall. I twisted it slowly, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. It was a kitchen, though barely recognizable as one. A rusted stove leaned sideways, half of its legs missing. Cabinets hung crooked with their doors wide open. Glass jars sat along the counter, most filled with dirt or something worse. The smell hit me hard, rancid and sour, like spoiled meat that had been left too long. I backed away, swallowing down the bile that rose in my throat. But as I turned, my flashlight beam caught something in the corner of the room. Bootprints. They weren't old and faded like everything else in that cabin. These were dark, clear impressions pressed into the dusty floor, leading from the doorway to the far corner and disappearing behind one of the cabinets. I froze. My first thought was that someone else had been here recently, maybe even still was. I shut the flashlight off instinctively, leaving myself in darkness. My ears strained for any sound, breathing, shifting, anything. But all I heard was the faint creak of the cabin settling and the blood pounding in my own head. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. Then, slowly, I turned it back on and aimed the beam at the cabinet where the prints disappeared. The wooden base had been shifted, leaving just enough space behind it for someone to squeeze through. That was enough for me. I backed out of the hallway, moving carefully but fast, trying to avoid making noise. My boots slid across the warped boards, and once I reached the front door, I pushed it open and stepped out into the cool evening air. I didn't stop moving. I jogged back to my car, heart racing, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the ground. I half expected to hear footsteps chasing me or to see someone darting from the trees, but the woods stayed silent. When I got inside the car, I slammed the locks down and started the engine. Gravel shot out from under my tires as I pulled back onto the road. I didn't look back at the cabin. It took me nearly an hour of wrong turns before I finally stumbled back onto a road I recognized, and by then the sky was pitch black. I drove the rest of the way to my friend's house without stopping. I never told him what happened. I never told anyone, but I've thought about it every day since. That cabin had been abandoned for decades, but those footprints were fresh, and the smell in that kitchen wasn't the kind of smell that lingers for 20 years. Someone had been staying there, hiding there, maybe even watching the road for people like me who wandered too close. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd pulled that cabinet away and looked behind it. All I know is I'm glad I didn't. I had been working long hours in London, and when the chance came to rent a small cabin in Northumberland for a week, I took it without much thought. It was October of 2016, cold and damp, and I was 32 at the time. I figured the quiet of the countryside would be good for me. The cabin sat on a patch of land at the edge of some woods, about a 15-minute walk from a narrow road where I had to leave my car. The place was simple, with 2 rooms, a wood stove, and electricity that came from an old generator. When I first arrived, the air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves. The land around the cabin was uneven, with tall grass, brambles, and a scattering of birch trees. There was no other house in sight. I unlocked the cabin, set down my bag, and looked around. The inside was colder than outside, with that earthy smell old buildings get when they sit shut for too long. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, and the small windows let in only a dim light because the trees were crowding close. The first day passed quietly. I stacked some wood near the stove, cooked a simple meal on a small portable hob, and sat with a book. The silence was different than what I was used to. In the city, even late at night, there's a hum from cars and people. Here, when I paused to listen, it was nothing but the faint drip of water off the eaves or the wind brushing through branches. At first, it felt peaceful, but by nightfall, that quiet began pressing down on me. I slept poorly, waking several times to the sound of twigs snapping outside. I told myself it was deer moving through the brush or a fox looking for food. Still, I found myself sitting up in the dark, listening hard. Each time I would lie back down, forcing myself to stay calm. On the second evening, I decided to walk further into the woods before it got too dark. The ground was damp and uneven, and the air smelled of rotting leaves. The trees grew closer together as I went, blocking what little light was left. After about 20 minutes, I reached a clearing. There was a crumbling stone wall, half buried in moss, probably part of some old farm boundary. That's when I noticed her, a woman standing near the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a birch. She wasn't close, maybe 30 feet away, but I could see her pale face and dark hair hanging loose. She wasn't moving. She just stood there watching. My stomach dropped, and every muscle in my body went tense. I didn't say anything. I just turned and started walking back the way I'd come, not running but moving as quickly as I could without tripping. My back prickled, and I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing except the crunch of my own boots. When I finally saw the cabin, I shut the door hard and bolted it. I told myself it was probably some hiker or local out for a walk, but something about the way she stood there, still and silent, gnawed at me. That night, the noise outside was worse. I lay awake in the dark, listening. At first, it was faint rustling, then the distinct sound of someone stepping on the porch. The boards creaked. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. Whoever was out there didn't knock, didn't try the door. They just stood there. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, until finally the sound stopped, and I must have drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I opened the door to check. The porch boards were damp with dew, but near the step there was a mark where the wood was cleaner, as if someone had stood there for a while. No boot print, no shape I could make out clearly, but enough to unsettle me further. By the fourth day, I was worn down from lack of sleep. Every shadow outside the window made me jump. I decided I would cut the trip short and head home the next morning. That evening, I packed most of my things, leaving just enough out to get through the night. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every creak of the cabin made me snap my head up. It was past midnight when I heard it again. The boards on the porch groaned, then a slow dragging sound, like someone's sleeve brushing against the wall. I sat upright, my chest tight, sweat forming on my forehead even though the air was cold. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then I saw movement through the small side window. The woman was standing in the yard, not more than 10 feet away. The moonlight was weak, but I could see her clearly. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her hair clung to her shoulders, wet or dirty, I couldn't tell. She was wearing a long coat that looked old, the kind that might have been heavy wool, though it hung loosely as if it didn't fit her. She wasn't moving toward the cabin. She was just watching the same way she had in the woods. I crouched low on the floor, keeping out of sight of the window. My breathing was ragged, and I could feel my pulse hammering at my throat. I stayed like that for what must have been an hour, hardly moving, until the yard outside was empty again. At dawn, I loaded my bag and left. When I stepped onto the porch, the boards were damp again, and in the patch of dirt just beyond the steps, I saw what looked like the faint imprint of a bare foot. Not sharp, not fresh, but enough that I could make out the curve of toes. I didn't linger. I walked quickly down the path, looking over my shoulder every few steps, until I reached the car. I drove the winding road back toward the motorway without stopping, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I looked it up online. The listing was gone. The man who had rented it to me never answered the number again. I don't know who that woman was or why she was out there night after night, but I do know she was real. Not a dream, not my imagination. I had seen her standing in the clearing, then at the edge of the yard, closer each night. What unsettles me most is not the memory of her face, but the certainty I felt in those moments, that she was waiting for something, watching me, measuring the distance between us. And I'll never know what might have happened if I had stayed one more night. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of northern Minnesota when I finally pulled off the narrow gravel road and onto a rutted dirt path that cut into the woods. It was late September of 1998, and I had just turned 30. The trip wasn't supposed to be anything fancy, just a few days alone in a cabin I'd borrowed from a coworker. He said he used it for deer hunting every fall and promised it was stocked with basics. The thought of quiet days away from the city, fishing and reading by the fire, seemed perfect to me. The cabin sat about 6 miles from the nearest paved road, and the deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it got. No traffic, no houses, no power lines, nothing but tall pine trees and low brush. My truck rattled over the uneven path until finally, after what felt like an hour, the woods opened slightly. The cabin was there, tucked into the trees, weathered but still standing solid. It was small, just one story with a slanted roof and a front porch with 2 broken chairs leaning against the wall. I parked in the dirt clearing and sat for a moment with the engine idling. The place had a strange stillness, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I told myself it was just the difference from city noise, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and faint mildew. The windows were streaked, and spiderwebs filled the corners. The floor creaked under my boots, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. I unpacked slowly, setting my duffel on the cot and stacking canned food on the counter. There was no electricity, just a lantern, a wood stove, and a hand pump out back for water. The first night went quietly enough. I sat by the stove, eating beans from a tin and listening to the woods outside. At one point, I heard what I thought was an animal moving in the brush near the tree line, but it passed quickly. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was just a deer. The second day, I fished in the nearby creek. It was narrow, shallow, and cold, but I managed to pull a couple of small trout. Cleaning them out on the porch, I caught myself glancing toward the trees more than once. I kept thinking I saw movement, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing but branches swaying in the breeze. That night, things began to feel different. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it sounded like slow, heavy footsteps on dry leaves. They would stop, then start again like someone circling the cabin. I lay still on the cot, heart pounding, straining to hear. The steps stopped completely after a few minutes, and I finally drifted back into a restless sleep. By morning, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I spent the day cutting some dead branches for firewood and walking a little farther down the creek. When I returned, I noticed something strange in the dirt near the porch. There were footprints, not boots like mine, but worn shoes, the tread almost smooth. They circled the cabin and disappeared back into the woods. I crouched down, trying to measure them with my hand. They looked like a man's size, maybe 10 or 11. My stomach tightened. I told myself maybe some hiker had gotten turned around. It wasn't unheard of, but the cabin was far from any trail. Still, I tried to ignore the unease and carried on. That night, the footsteps came back. I had the lantern turned low, sitting in the corner by the cot with my hunting knife in hand. The sound of crunching leaves moved slowly around the cabin, sometimes pausing near a window. Once, something brushed against the side of the wall, a dull thud like a shoulder or hand pressing against the boards. I sat there frozen, barely breathing. The steps retreated after what felt like an hour, fading back into the woods. Sleep never came after that. At dawn, I stepped outside, knife still in my pocket. The ground was marked up with more prints, fresh ones, looping around the cabin and leading off into the trees. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but stubbornness kept me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was nothing serious. The fourth day was cloudy, the air damp. I hardly left the cabin. Every sound outside made me jump. Around dusk, I went to the pump to fill a pot of water, and that's when I saw something that chilled me worse than anything yet. At the edge of the tree line stood a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and completely still, watching me. I froze with the pot in my hands. My throat went dry. I wanted to yell, but no sound came out. After what felt like forever, I turned and walked quickly back into the cabin, slamming the door and barring it with the piece of wood I had leaned against the frame. I stayed at the window, peeking through the dirty glass, but the man was gone. That night was the longest of my life. The steps came back, louder this time, circling faster. I heard the porch creak as if weight pressed onto it. Something scratched at the door, not claws but fingers, slow and deliberate. I gripped the knife, sweat running down my back. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Hours dragged by until the woods grew quiet again. At first light, I stuffed everything back into my duffel, grabbed my gear, and ran to the truck. The dirt path felt longer than ever, every shadow in the trees making me glance over my shoulder. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the keys trying to start the engine. When the truck roared to life, I floored it, bouncing over ruts until I hit the gravel road. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station nearly 20 miles away. I told the man behind the counter that someone had been lurking near the cabin. He just looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. He said people sometimes camped in those woods who didn't want to be found, squatters, drifters, sometimes worse. He didn't look surprised. I never went back for the rest of my things. I left the cabin as it was, food, clothes, even my fishing gear. I told my coworker I'd rather not borrow it again, and when he asked why, I only said the place didn't suit me. But even now, years later, I can still hear those footsteps circling in the dark, slow and patient, as if whoever was out there knew I was inside and was just waiting for the right time. It was late October of 2016 when I found myself driving through the back roads of northern Minnesota. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet leaves and pine. The sky had been gray all day, and now, as evening closed in, the first drops of cold rain started tapping against the windshield of my old Ford. The wipers dragged across the glass, squeaking at times, smearing more than clearing, and it felt like every mile of the drive pressed me deeper into a place I didn't want to be. I hadn't planned on passing the cabin. In fact, I had gone out of my way for years to avoid it. But a detour sign on the highway pushed me onto a narrower county road, and before I even realized where I was, I started recognizing the curves, the ditches, the leaning birch trees that had always stood like markers along the route. My stomach sank the moment I saw the old rusted mailbox at the bend, half swallowed by tall weeds. The paint had long since peeled off, and the numbers were barely visible, but I knew exactly where I was. That cabin had once been my ex-husband's pride. He built most of it with his own hands back in the late 90s before we met. He used to take me there in the early years of our marriage, talking about it like it was his safe place, somewhere away from the noise of life. But to me, it had never felt safe. The silence of the woods at night always pressed too close, the walls too thin against the long stretches of blackness outside. After the divorce, I promised myself I would never go near it again. And yet, there I was, the rain picking up, the road slick and narrow, my headlights cutting a pale yellow line through the growing mist. As I passed the mailbox, I slowed down almost without meaning to. The gravel turnoff curved into the trees, overgrown but still visible, leading to the cabin I hadn't seen in more than 8 years. My chest tightened as I thought about the nights I had stayed there, the long walks he used to take into the woods, leaving me alone with the creaks and groans of the old place. I told myself to keep driving, just keep moving, don't look back. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. I hadn't thought about that cabin in so long, and suddenly I needed to know what it looked like now, if it was still standing, if time had swallowed it back into the woods. I pulled onto the shoulder, the tires crunching wet gravel, and shut off the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there, listening to the rain patter on the roof of the car. The woods around me were dark, but not silent. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, branches clattering together, water dripping heavy from the pine needles. My pulse thudded in my throat, but my hand was already on the door handle. I stepped out, the cold air hitting me hard, and pulled my jacket tight. The rain soaked through the shoulders within seconds, but I walked toward the turnoff anyway. The gravel was slick, half buried in wet leaves. The narrow path twisted between tall pines, leading me further in. Every step I took, the air grew stiller, the sound of the rain muffled by the thick branches above. When the cabin came into view, I stopped. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, the same clearing where we used to stack firewood and hang laundry lines. But now the grass was waist-high, and thorny weeds had grown up against the porch. The wood siding was darker than I remembered, rotting in places with green moss crawling up the base. One of the shutters hung loose, banging faintly in the wind. I felt a strange pull, a mixture of dread and something like nostalgia, though I hated to admit it. The porch sagged, boards warped and broken, but I climbed onto it anyway, my boots thudding hollow against the old wood. The front door was shut but not locked. It gave with a groan when I pushed, and the smell hit me instantly. It was the heavy, damp odor of mildew and rot, mixed with something sharper, old smoke maybe, or the stale remains of a place shut too long. Inside, the air was cold and wet. The main room looked almost exactly as I remembered, only more decayed. The stone fireplace was still there, blackened from old fires, with ash scattered across the hearth. The couch slumped under a torn blanket, springs pushing up through the cushions. The table in the corner was covered with a thick layer of dust, except for faint drag marks where something had been moved recently. That stopped me. Recently? My throat tightened as I ran my fingers along the dust, feeling the clean streaks where objects had been shifted. Maybe it was animals, I told myself, raccoons or squirrels, but the streaks were wide, deliberate, like something heavy had been dragged across. I forced myself to look around more. The old bookshelf leaned crooked, its contents swollen from damp air. A pair of boots sat by the door, cracked leather stiff with age. My eyes went to the back hallway where the 2 small bedrooms were. The door to the one we used to sleep in stood half open, dark inside. I felt the urge to check, to prove to myself nothing was there, but my body didn't want to move. My heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. I finally stepped closer, my boots echoing against the warped floorboards. The bedroom smelled even stronger of mildew, but underneath it there was another smell I couldn't place at first. Something sour, almost metallic. The bed frame was still there, but the mattress was stripped bare, stained in patches I didn't want to look too closely at. I backed out quickly, my stomach knotting. I didn't want to know what those stains were. I didn't want to stand in that room another second. Back in the main area, the rain tapped faintly against the roof, but the cabin felt too quiet, like the woods were pressing down around it. That's when I noticed the window. The glass was fogged, streaked with dirt, but in the haze of fading daylight, I could see something outside. A fresh path had been trampled through the grass of the clearing, leading toward the tree line. The grass was still bent, wet from the rain. Someone had been here recently. Not years ago, not months ago, recently. My chest went tight as I realized how alone I was, standing in this rotting cabin with no one knowing I'd taken this road. My car was hidden at the shoulder, my phone useless with no service in these woods, and there were fresh signs of someone else's presence. I left fast. I didn't bother shutting the door, didn't care about the noise of my boots slapping against the wet ground. I followed the overgrown drive back out, heart racing, every shadow in the woods looking too solid, every crack of a branch under the wind making me jerk. By the time I reached my car, I was soaked through and shaking. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine with trembling hands. The headlights lit up the wet gravel and the dripping trees, and for one moment before I pulled away, I looked back. From the road, the cabin was hidden behind the trees, but I couldn't stop thinking about those drag marks in the dust, those bent paths in the grass. Someone was still using that place. I drove until I hit the main highway again, not once looking in the rearview mirror. Even now, years later, I can still feel the damp cold of that cabin in my chest when I think about it. I know I'll never go back down that road again. Whatever's inside that place now, it's not my past anymore. It belongs to someone else. I had been planning the trip for weeks, thinking a few days away in the mountains would do me good. It was early October of 2017, and the weather had just started to turn colder. I packed up my old Ford with supplies, dry food, canned goods, a sleeping bag, and a small propane heater just in case the nights dropped lower than I expected. My dog, Max, a 6-year-old German Shepherd, rode shotgun, his nose pressed against the cracked window most of the way. The cabin I had rented wasn't much, just a small structure tucked into the Colorado foothills near Estes Park. It was the kind of place you could miss if you didn't know where to look. The road up was narrow, full of potholes, and lined with trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight the higher I drove. When I finally pulled into the clearing, the cabin sat quiet, roof darkened with years of weather, windows staring back like empty eyes. Inside was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area with a propane burner, and a back bedroom with a narrow bed. The smell was that mix of old pine, dust, and faint mildew that seemed to cling to every remote cabin I had ever stayed in. It was quiet, too quiet, and I could feel the silence pressing in as I unpacked. Max sniffed every corner, tail wagging but ears alert. He was always my alarm system, catching things before I ever did. I trusted him more than I trusted locks on doors. The first night passed without much trouble. I cooked a can of chili on the burner, listened to the wind scraping through the trees, and eventually fell asleep to the sound of Max shifting at the foot of the bed. Around midnight, he growled low once, but then settled again. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon outside and went back to sleep. The next morning, the world was damp and gray. A light drizzle had moved in overnight. I decided to chop some wood and keep the stove running hot in case the rain stuck around. While I worked outside, I noticed something in the mud about 20 feet from the cabin. At first I thought it was just tracks from a deer, but as I bent down, I realized they were boot prints. Heavy ones, deep like someone had been standing there for a while. I felt that tightness in my stomach. The cabin was supposed to be secluded, no one around for miles. I told myself it might have been an old hunter passing through days ago, but the edges of the print were sharp. They hadn't been there long. Max must have sensed my unease, because he stayed closer to me than usual that whole day. He'd run a little ahead on the trails, but never out of sight. Every so often, he'd stop, ears up, staring into the trees like he heard something I didn't. By the second night, the rain had picked up. It hammered the roof, making it hard to hear anything else outside. I kept the lantern low and tried to read, but Max wouldn't settle. He paced back and forth, nails clicking on the wooden floor, then sat facing the door, growling softly. I set my book aside, grabbed the flashlight, and checked outside. The beam cut through sheets of rain, catching only dripping branches and fog rising from the ground. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. When I came back inside, I noticed water pooling near the window by the sink. At first, I thought the roof leaked, but when I wiped it away, I saw streaks like dirty fingerprints on the glass. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking to the sound of Max moving, circling the room, then stopping at the door. At one point, just before dawn, I swore I heard the crunch of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving past the cabin. Max barked then, loud and sharp, and the footsteps stopped. We stayed awake until the first bit of gray light showed through the trees. The next day, I debated leaving, but stubbornness kept me there. I didn't want to feel like I had been chased out by my own nerves. I tried to busy myself, hiking a short way down the ridge with Max. The forest was dense and wet, full of that earthy smell of soaked leaves and moss. A few times Max froze, hackles raised, staring down the slope, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. Back at the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. Behind the woodpile, half hidden, was a crushed cigarette butt. I don't smoke. No one had been there before me, at least not officially. Someone had been standing behind my cabin, smoking, watching. That night, I didn't bother pretending to relax. I set a chair against the door, kept my flashlight and knife within reach, and sat awake for hours listening. The rain had finally stopped, and the silence outside was worse. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves carried sharp against the stillness. Max lay against the door, his body stiff, head up, ears twitching constantly. Around 2 a.m, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying the handle of the cabin door. Slow, careful. The knob turned just enough to make the wood creak. My chest pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. Max snarled, deep and vicious, teeth bared. Whoever it was paused. Then I heard footsteps retreating into the trees. Not running, but walking away like they had all the time in the world. I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed. I shoved everything into the truck, barely caring if it was neat. My hands shook the whole time, adrenaline still running high. Before I left, I walked once around the cabin. Near the back window, pressed into the soft ground, were fresh boot prints. Right below the glass, the drive out felt endless. Every bend in the road, I half expected to see a figure standing there. Max stayed restless until we were back on the highway, then finally curled up and slept like he had been holding himself on edge for days. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling. I replayed the nights over and over, the sounds, the prints, the cigarette butt. It wasn't an animal or my imagination. Someone had been there, watching me, waiting. I never went back to that cabin. I called the rental company, told them what I found, but they brushed it off, said hunters pass through all the time. Maybe that was true, but hunters don't usually stand at your window in the middle of the night. Hunters don't test your door handle while you sleep. Max has been gone for 2 years now, but when I think of that trip, I realize he probably saved me. If he hadn't been there, alert and loud, I don't know if the person outside would have stopped. I still camp, but I stick to places with other people around. Secluded cabins in the woods, never again. I had been driving for hours before I even thought about stopping. The two-lane road stretched for miles through pine woods, and the gas stations grew farther and farther apart. It was early October of 1998, and I was on my way to Montana for work, but I'd taken the back roads through Idaho instead of staying on the interstate. At the time, I thought it would save me time, but all it did was push me deeper into a part of the country I didn't know well. The leaves had already started to turn, and the air felt heavy with that kind of cold that clings to your clothes long after the sun goes down. By the time dusk settled, I knew I wasn't going to make it to any motel. My headlights cut through the dark, showing only trees, endless trees, and sometimes a turnoff leading deeper into them. That's when I saw the small wooden sign nailed to a post. It looked old, like it had been there for decades. It simply said, "Cabins, 2 miles." The arrow pointed down a dirt road that disappeared into blackness. I pulled over at the turnoff and thought about it. I was tired, hungry, and I hadn't eaten anything since a gas station sandwich earlier that day. I didn't like the idea of driving blind all night, not out here where cell service was spotty and deer could dart across the road at any second. I turned onto the dirt road. My tires crunched gravel, and the woods seemed to swallow me up. The cabins appeared after a while, maybe half a mile in. There were 3 of them, each spread out along a clearing. They were small, single-story, with dark wood siding and tin roofs that caught the little bit of moonlight breaking through the clouds. None of them had cars parked outside, and for a moment, I wondered if the place was even still open. I killed the engine, rolled the window down, and listened. Nothing. No dogs barking, no voices, no music. Just the sound of wind running through pine needles. I decided to check one out. The first cabin had its front door unlocked. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it wasn't falling apart. There was a cot, a small table, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A lantern sat on the counter near the sink. It wasn't clean exactly, but it was shelter. I figured maybe the owners left them open for hunters or travelers, maybe a pay-on-the-honor system. That kind of thing still existed in places like this. I set my duffel bag down and tried to make myself at home. I didn't have much food, just a protein bar and a bottle of water. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot and lit the lantern with the matches I carried. The light flickered against the log walls, and for a moment, it almost felt cozy. Almost. But the longer I sat there, the more wrong the place felt. The air inside was colder than outside, and it carried a damp smell that I couldn't shake. When I turned off the lantern for a moment to save fuel, the darkness inside the cabin pressed against me in a way that didn't feel natural. I lit it again quickly, telling myself I was just tired. I laid down, fully dressed, boots and all, because something in my gut told me not to get too comfortable. The silence outside was heavy, not the normal quiet you hear in the woods. Usually, you can pick up distant owls, the rustle of small animals, maybe even a coyote yipping far off. Here, there was nothing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Somewhere around midnight, I heard it. A crunch outside. Slow, deliberate steps on gravel. My body tensed instantly, and my ears strained against the silence. At first, I thought maybe it was just a deer, but deer don't walk like that. They're quicker, lighter. This was slower, heavier. Someone was walking outside my cabin. I didn't move. I kept the lantern dim, laying still on the cot, but my heart hammered so hard I was sure it could be heard through the walls. The steps came closer until they stopped right outside the door. Then nothing. Minutes crawled by. I didn't dare get up. I just stared at the door, every muscle tight, waiting. After a while, the steps started again, this time circling the cabin. I heard the crunch of gravel around the sides, then the back. Whoever it was moved slow, dragging their feet a little. They stopped by the window on the left side of the cabin. I could hear the faint sound of breath. I stayed frozen, afraid to even shift in the bed. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, fading back toward the trees. I waited another hour before I finally let myself breathe normally again. Sleep was impossible after that. Every noise made me twitch. At some point, exhaustion got the better of me, but I kept jerking awake, listening. By dawn, I decided I'd had enough. I rolled up my bag, stuffed it in my duffel, and stepped outside. That's when I saw them. Tracks, clear footprints in the dirt and gravel, circling my cabin exactly like I'd heard. They weren't animal prints. They were boots, worn tread, large size. The tracks led out of the clearing into the trees, not toward the dirt road. Whoever it was hadn't come by car. I didn't waste time. I threw my bag in the car, slammed the door, and started the engine. As I backed out, I looked toward the other two cabins. That's when I noticed something that chilled me more than the footsteps. The farthest cabin, the one half hidden in the trees, had its door wide open. From where I was, I could just make out the edge of something inside. It looked like a chair tipped over, but I didn't want to get close enough to check. I drove out fast, gravel spraying behind me. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they ached. I didn't stop until I hit the highway an hour later, and only then did I let myself pull over and breathe. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling. Who had been out there that night circling my cabin? Why hadn't they tried to come in? And what was inside that open cabin at the far end of the clearing? I never found out, but one thing was clear. Those cabins weren't abandoned by chance. Someone still used them. Someone who didn't expect me to be there, and someone who made sure I knew I wasn't welcome. I never drove those back roads again. And every time I see a weathered sign pointing toward cabins or campgrounds deep in the woods, I keep driving. Some places are better left empty. I still remember the way the gravel cracked under the tires as I pulled off the old two-lane highway and onto the dirt road. It was late October, 1997. I was 34 years old at the time, and I had taken a week off work to get away from the noise of the city. A friend of mine had mentioned an old hunting cabin out in northern Montana, tucked away near the tree line by a wide stream. The owner had passed a few years back, and it had been sitting empty. Supposedly, people could stay there as long as they respected the place. No rent, no paperwork, just the kind of handshake deal you don't hear about anymore. The road narrowed until branches scraped the sides of my truck, and when the cabin came into view, I felt both relieved and uneasy. It was a small structure, weathered and leaning a little to one side. The roof was patched with different shades of tin, and the front steps sagged under their own weight. The kind of place that smelled like rot and damp earth even before you stepped inside. I parked in the clearing and sat for a moment, engine ticking, staring at the cabin. I told myself it would be fine. I had food, water, a kerosene lamp, a sleeping bag, and a rifle. I wasn't there for comfort. I was there for quiet. Inside, the air was stale, the floorboards soft in spots. A table with one leg braced by a log sat in the corner, two chairs beside it. Against the wall, a cast iron stove with rust crawling up its sides. Someone had left a cracked enamel mug on the shelf above it, coated in dust thick enough to write in with a finger. I set my gear down, unrolled my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the drafty window, and spent the rest of the afternoon splitting some firewood from the stack outside. The sound of the axe striking through the logs echoed through the trees. The forest out there was heavy and quiet, as if it pressed in closer the longer I worked. By sundown, I had a small fire going in the stove. The wind picked up, whistling faintly through gaps in the walls, and the woods outside darkened fast. I ate a can of beans, washed it down with a bottle of water, and sat listening to the fire pop. No radio, no phone service, no distractions. Just me and the woods. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Around midnight, I woke up sweating. The fire had died down, and the cabin was dark. I thought it was the silence that woke me, but then I realized I had heard something. Something small and sharp, like sticks snapping. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal nosing around. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was deliberate. Steps, slow, unhurried, moving around the outside of the cabin. I stayed still, staring at the black ceiling. The sound circled once, then stopped. I waited for the handle of the door to turn, for the boards to creak under weight, for something to happen. But nothing came. Eventually, I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe just branches rubbing together, and I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud by the side of the cabin. Not boots, shoes. Flat soles, worn thin, small enough that they couldn't have been mine. Whoever had been there had walked right up to the window and stood there. The mud was freshly pressed. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself maybe hunters passed through, maybe kids from a nearby town. I didn't want to admit I was scared, not of some stranger in the woods. I spent the day walking the area, carrying the rifle slung over my shoulder, trying to shake off the unease. I followed the stream down a mile or so and found nothing. No campsites, no trash, no sign of anyone else. The woods were still and empty, but I couldn't get the image out of my head of someone standing outside in the dark, watching me sleep. That night, I bolted the door and set the rifle close by. The fire threw shadows against the walls, and every pop of the wood made me jump. I tried reading a paperback I had brought, but I couldn't focus. Sometime past midnight, the sound came again. Steps, closer this time. They came right up to the door. The boards creaked under the weight. I could hear breathing. I sat frozen with the rifle in my hands, my finger just above the trigger. Whoever was out there didn't knock, didn't try the handle. They just stood there. Minutes passed. My chest hurt from holding my breath. Finally, the steps moved again, slow and steady, circling the cabin until they faded into the woods. When dawn came, I opened the door. Muddy prints again. Same size, same worn shoes. This time, they led away into the trees. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared over rocks and dry ground. For the next 2 days, it was the same thing. During daylight, nothing. No voices, no movement, just the endless trees. At night, the steps would come, circling, pausing by the windows or door, then retreating. By the fourth night, I was shaking with exhaustion. I barely slept, rifle across my lap, staring into the dark. The food I had was running low, and my nerves were shot. I made the decision to leave the next morning, but that night was different. I woke to silence, and for a moment I thought maybe it was finally over. Then I smelled smoke. Not the stove, something sharper, acrid. I shot up, heart pounding, and saw it seeping through the cracks in the walls. I scrambled for the door and flung it open. The clearing glowed orange. A ring of fire had been set around the cabin, low flames licking up the grass and brush. Whoever had been out there all those nights wasn't just watching anymore. They wanted me trapped. I grabbed my pack and rifle and sprinted through the smoke, jumping over the flames where they burned lowest. The heat bit at my legs, and sparks caught in my jacket, but I kept running into the trees until the glow dimmed behind me. I didn't stop until dawn. My throat was raw from the smoke, my legs shaking. When I finally reached the road hours later, I flagged down the first truck I saw. The man inside stared at me like I was crazy, covered in ash and mud, but he let me climb in. I never went back for my truck, never even told the police. How could I explain it? No one would have believed me anyway. A man alone in the woods, hearing steps at night, finding footprints, almost burned alive. They call it stress or say I imagined it. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone out there had been watching me every night, circling that cabin, waiting for the right moment. And if I hadn't woken up when I did, I wouldn't be telling this now.